Hi folks, Melanie Blow here, talking at the request of your professor about what happens when we don't believe survivors of sexual violence. So that's a big question. So before we talk about what it's like to not believe survivors, let's think for a minute about what it's like to believe survivors. And I want you to, so let's imagine something here. Imagine you guys were in class one day, and class has been going for 10 minutes, and one of your classmates walks in and says, "I'm sorry I'm late, I was just in a car accident." What would you do? Well, what most of you would do, what 99% of you would do, would be you would take a deep breath and your jaw would drop a little and you would say, "I'm so sorry." And then, "Are you okay?" And maybe even the professor might say, "Is there anything you need? Is there anything I can do for you?" Now, that sounds really obvious, but think about that for a minute. You all know somewhere in the back of your mind that throughout the course of human events, people have lied about getting into car accidents. And people have there's two things people really have done with car accidents. One is that they've gotten into an accident on purpose for insurance money or whatever else. And the other is that they have, used it as an excuse when something else actually happened. We all know that that's happened, that that's possible. But when somebody tells us they've been in a car accident, our first instinct is to believe them and to feel sorry for them and to be at least somewhat helpful. If you call your insurance company after you're in a car accident, they don't give you the third degree. There's actually, at least with my insurance, there is a specific phone menu. If you want to report an accident, press this number. And if you press that number, you talk to somebody who doesn't say mean things to you and doesn't treat you as though he expects you to be lying. They just want information about the accident. If you call the police after an accident, they treat you the same way. They ask you what happened. They realize when it's a two-car collision that each person is going to give a different account. They write them both down, and they really reserve judgment on it unless it's really obvious what happened. I mean, sometimes they can figure out just at a glance what actually did happen. Sometimes somebody will admit, sometimes both parties do say the exact same thing, whatever. But when they're called out to the scene of a motor vehicle accident, they don't assume somebody is just making it up. They also don't assume that two people orchestrated this big, elaborate thing for some ulterior motive. See. Now, okay, so those are car accidents. Why do we assume that people are going to tell the truth about car accidents and they're not going to tell the truth about sexual violence? Well, that's a good question. I think there's a couple of answers to that. One of them is that it's a car accident. The word accident is built right into it. They're not car deliberates. Everybody knows that people do make mistakes on the road. People do unwise things on the road. And everybody does unwise things on the road. So every time somebody hears about a car accident, somewhere in the back of their mind, they kind of know, well, there but for the grace go I. And if somebody tells somebody that they were in a car accident, they may say, in the back of their mind, usually, very few people are rude enough to do this, but they might say something like, "Oh, well, they're not a very good driver," or "they text a lot," or "they drive fast," or whatever. But we all do things. We all break the speed limit. We all have run a stop sign once or twice. We've all texted once or twice. That's life. And we don't consider somebody who makes little mistakes while they're driving to be a very horrible person. Now here's where the metaphor breaks down a little bit, because a sexual assault is not a mistake. This is an extremely deliberate act. And I think this is one of the reasons why we tend not to believe survivors, is because if someone is saying they're raped, that means somebody raped them. And if you know somebody who was raped, well, and you believe them, it means either two things. Either a perfect stranger raped them, that means you're at risk, or somebody who wasn't a perfect stranger raped them, and especially if this is somebody you know, that's a really horrible thing to believe. That's called cognitive dissonance, and that's a lot of it. To try to believe two conflicting things about somebody, being basically they're a nice person and they raped somebody. So that's tough. We don't like doing it. It takes a lot of work and a lot of, you really have to apply yourself and really think about it a lot to get used to it. It's something that, like incest survivors, it takes us years of therapy very often to get to that point, that you can understand that somebody who is nice in some ways and kind and has some redeeming features can do horrible things. When somebody we barely know says it, it's hard. It takes some getting used to get your mind into a place where you can believe that. So, we don't, it can be uncomfortable for us to believe survivors. We also, the media is kind of weird about this. The media does not report every rape that happens, does not report a tiny percentage of rapes that happen. The laws about this are very weird. Well, it's not really laws. It's their own insurance companies, their own lawyers tell them not to report about sexual assaults unless there is usually an arrest. Those don't happen all that often. We'll get to that in a minute. Unless there's an arrest, unless there's a lot of documentation, they don't want to report about them. And often, even if there is, they still don't want to report about them. I've seen newspapers that say it is not our policy to publish reports about child sexual abuse. It didn't say to identify the victims. It said to publish this at all. I don't understand. I can't wrap my mind around that. This was a paper in Kansas or someplace. And the reason that policy was mentioned was because they were violating it once for a really remarkable sequence of events that had happened. But that's the newspapers don't report that. But if there is an accusation of sexual assault that then it gets recanted or something like that, the accuser is found to be lying in the court of law, then all of a sudden the media will report it for two reasons. One is to cover their own butts, because if they covered the initial part of the case, when the victim did come forward and say, I was sexually abused or raped or whatever, they need to finish up that story or else they're going to get sued for libel, or at least they fear that they will. And now suddenly something that's uncommon has happened, and that makes it newsworthy. Unfortunately, most people who watch the news aren't all that critical of what they watch, and even if they don't understand the context, if they don't understand the statistics about how all of this plays out, they don't realize what they're getting into. They don't realize it. So if you are watching the news for a month and you happen to see 5 stories about sexual assaults, and maybe one of them happens to be a story where somebody recants or is found to be lying for whatever reason. In your mind, 20% of victims are making it up. That's not accurate. The actual statistics are about 2% for children and about 10% for adults, which means it's, if somebody tells you they were raped, they probably were. So what happens when you don't believe survivors? Okay, let's go back to our car accidents. Somebody says they were in a car accident. You believe them. By believing them, you're saying, okay, I trust that you are a halfway honest human being. I trust that you're intelligent enough to know what a car accident is. And I trust that you're not some kind of a scammer who's out to get insurance money or whatever else you're trying to get. When you don't believe somebody about who says they were in a car accident, you're telling them the exact same thing. You're telling them, well, you're a liar, or you're stupid, or you're a scammer. When somebody tells you that they were sexually assaulted and you don't believe them, you're basically conveying the same things. You're saying either, well, you're a liar, you're a horrible person, because everybody does know that accusing somebody of this is really, really bad and criminal and not nice. And especially with sexual assault, as opposed to really any other crime, you'll hear, well, are you sure? I'm not entirely sure where that even comes from. People have called the police to say, I think my house was burglarized because the door is blown open or something like that. They forgot to lock the door and it opens. No one really gets worked up about that. But with sexual assaults, well, are you sure? He raped you? Are you sure? And from the point of view of the person who's asking that's usually an expression of their cognitive dissonance. It's an expression of they're just really, really uncomfortable. They were not expecting to hear that. But to the point of view of the person who's saying it, it's enormously insulting. And it tells them that there's people in this world who I trusted who I shouldn't have. Somebody who's been sexually assaulted already realizes that. But now they're reaching out and asking for help in one way or another, because when you tell somebody that is essentially what you're doing. And now they're hearing, are you sure? I have never in my life heard of somebody who was genuinely unsure that they were sexually assaulted. People who are sexually assaulted after being drugged won't have a lot of details about it, but if they think that nothing happened, they're not going to say, I think I was sexually assaulted because I passed out, but I have really nothing. No, nobody's going to say that. Nobody does say that. Especially in the context of sexual assault, it makes people very uncomfortable. So we try to we've invented classes of victims. This is February of 2017 right now. The story's already a little bit old, but last month there was a story about a New York City police chief or somebody like that who referred to rapes by strangers as the really heinous ones or something like that. which implied that the majority of rapes that are not committed by strangers are somehow not so bad. And that's incredibly insulting, and that's incredibly inaccurate. And it made a lot of people angry. But really, this guy was expressing what a lot of people believe, which is that some sexual assaults just aren't so bad. Well, again, if we believe that people are, if you believe that sexual assaults by strangers are really, really bad, well, the nice thing about that belief system is that they're also really, really rare, and we can do things that we think will protect us from, it will protect us from it. I mean, you can not walk alone at night, and you can carry little whistles and mace and flashlights and you name it. I mean, there's all kinds of industries that are dedicated to that. There are all kinds of industries dedicated to making women feel safe alone. Really, to make that work, they have to make women believe that they're in danger when they're alone, in the dark, in parking garages or streets or whatever. And that's really not true. As I'm sure you know, most sexual assaults are committed by people who are known to the victim, and there's at least some degree of trust between them and the victim. It's much, from a marketing point of view, it's really hard to convince women to, I don't know, carry mace with them when they're home, cooking dinner for their partner or something like that. It's really hard to make you feel afraid in your own home, or afraid when you're on a date with somebody who you know, or afraid when you're at a party with a bunch of people you know. But, that if we were actually trying, that's the way it would work, but that's not the prevailing myth. It's fairly easy to be afraid of strangers. I think anybody who's taking this class has probably grown up post-1980 when the whole stranger danger thing happened, the whole movement was born. It's almost normal for us to have some distrust of strangers. Most of us would not think about going into taking a ride from a stranger or stuff like that. Especially a woman, we're very suspicious about this, because we've just been told our whole lives that we should be. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but nobody tells you, be careful when you're on a date. If you're afraid of strangers, okay, that's not good, but it's much easier than being afraid of people who you are supposed to trust, people you're supposed to be in an intimate relationship with. That stuff is really crippling. So we just assume it won't happen to us. We just assume that nobody in our circle is going to harm us, and that's it. It makes us feel safer. And most of the time, if somebody does tell you they were sexually assaulted, if they tell you it happened yesterday or recently, and this is an adult who's talking to you, then it probably did happen under those circumstances. If they're talking about it happening a long time ago, then it would have happened to their child, and that's parallel circumstances. Children who are sexually abused are usually abused by somebody very close to them, about half of the time family, about half of the time not. But that's a little bit different. But so you tell a victim you don't, or even if you don't tell somebody in so many words that you don't believe them, but you say things like, really? Or what happened? You're again, you're conveying disbelief to them, and you're implying that either they're lying to you or that they are just so stupid they can't understand what happened to their own body. And those aren't feelings that those don't make people feel good. If people think that they're going to get more and more responses like that, they're probably not going to tell law enforcement. They're probably not going to go to the hospital. They're probably not going to tell other people who could support them. When rapes and sexual assaults are not brought forward to law enforcement, then there is absolutely no possibility that the rapist is going to experience consequences. And if he doesn't experience consequences, it's very unlikely he's going to stop. So we all have a vested interest in doing what little we can do to keep that from happening. So we all have a vested interest in at least being decent to survivors and not shutting them down. Going through the law enforcement process is very difficult. The same police officers who, if you tell them, I was my house was broken into, someone stole my purse, etc., etc. The people who will sit there and write down the report and don't ask you questions if you say you were sexually abused, that's very different. And they get very weird about it. And they do go around assuming that you are lying. Rapes are handled very differently than a lot of other crimes because police also, police will say, these are very serious accusations. We don't want to pin them on somebody unless we've done our due diligence. And I get that, but police need to be nice. Police need to realize the same statistics I just said, which is that it's rare for people to make these things up. If you're trying to start a rumor about somebody, there's lots of other things you can do that don't violate the law. And people do realize that. And let me assure you, if you talk to law enforcement, you realize that real fast. That making a false accusation of a sexual assault against somebody is a crime. And they don't take kindly to that. So law enforcement has its own way of sorting this thing out. And right now, it airs much too strongly in favor of keeping sex offenders from experiencing consequences. It is not anyone's job, unless you are in law enforcement or unless you are investigating the case, it is not your job to try to figure out if this happened. I think I should probably talk a little bit about what are some good things to do if somebody discloses that they were sexually assaulted. So some good things to do are to say things, if somebody says that they were sexually assaulted, whether they say it in so many words, whether they kind of hint around at it, whether if they do anything at all that gives you the impression that this is what happened, believe them. They're probably not making it up. Believe them. It is not your job to investigate it any more than if somebody says they get in a car accident, any more than you would drive out to the car and take your tape measure and your camera and measure the skid marks and take pictures of all that and, look at where the broken glass. You wouldn't do that. Don't do that if somebody tells you they were sexually assaulted. It is not your job to investigate it in any way, shape, or manner. So if somebody says, something really bad happened to me last night, you say, I'm sorry. Is there anything I can do for you? Do you need help? And you leave it at that. If you think you can talk about this again with the person without losing it, and if you can't, that's okay. But if you think you can and you want to make yourself available to discuss it further, then you can say that. You can say, if you ever want to talk about it, I can help you. I'm willing to listen. What you don't say is, what exactly happened? Because again, that's implying that, well, maybe they weren't really raped. Maybe they're just confused. You don't say who did it. Because again, that it's called sightseeing. That's all of a sudden you want to know a detail that is not necessary to helping your friend. You just want to know it because you're curious. That's understandable, but that somebody ever tells you that this happened to them, that is not the time to be curious. Your focus needs to be on the person in front of you right now. It's a good idea to get to, if you know, especially if you're trying to learn to be a helper as an adult. There's nothing wrong with having some contact information for a rape crisis center, for, well, everybody knows to call the police right now. For a rape crisis center, RAINN, RAINN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. They have a 1-800 number that you can call that will put you into contact with any, with nearest rape crisis center anywhere in the country. And they have a very strong online presence too. If you Google it, you'll figure it right out. It's also not your job if somebody tells you something that they were sexually assaulted. It's also not your job to say, well, you need to tell the police. You need to tell this one. You need to do that. That some people that's just not always going to happen. People all deal with trauma differently. And if someone just doesn't feel like they can do it, that's their choice. It can be really, really ugly to think about somebody not trying to press charges and letting a person who did something really terrible go away and experience without consequences. But if that's where that person is, that's where that person is. And there's nothing, it's not your job to convince them. You can mention it a couple of times, but you don't want to push them. Somebody who's been sexually assaulted has felt they've lost control of their body, their future, their life. To put them in a situation where they're losing control of anything else is just not good. So don't be the person to do it. Let's see. If somebody says they were sexually abused as a child, again, it's pretty much the same rules of engagement. You don't say, again, you don't need to say who, you don't need to get all the details. That's not your job. If somebody's there are some differences between disclosure of child sexual abuse and disclosure of rapes as adults. Adults do realize that this is a crime. I mean, adults who are familiar with Western civilization and everything like that. I mean, there's a lot of taboos over the way we talk about rape, but everybody knows it happens. Children don't necessarily have that. So there are places, adult sexual assault victims will disclose to somebody sometimes right shortly after the assault. With children, that's almost unheard of. So if somebody is disclosing something that happened to them as a child, and they're in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, or their 50s, this still might be the first time they're ever talking about it. And that can just seem very strange. That does lead some people to believe they're making it up. It just, it can seem very, it just seems kind of far-fetched for a lot of people. But here again, you need to believe the victims. You need to believe someone isn't making this up. Why would somebody just disclose that on the fly, if they haven't told anybody for all those years? They're not talking to the police, they're talking to you. You know, why would someone make that up? They've got nothing to gain from it. But the way people talk to victims does have a lot to do with how they're going to heal. And if somebody believes that everybody cares about them, that the world is full of people who are going to listen and take it seriously and stuff like that, then it's going to be a lot easier for them to talk to law enforcement and to do everything they've got to do to get somebody behind bars, which is a very desirable goal. If everybody they talk to is dismissive, is critical, is full of blame, then it's very unlikely that they will. And if there are some people who are really good to them and some people who aren't, well, again, it shows at least not the whole world is stacked against them. And, that's an option all of you have if you ever are around somebody who's disclosing sexual assault. Is you can be the person who does the right thing, and you can help somebody heal, and you can maybe help a bad guy have some consequences for what they did. If you are on the wrong side, if you do it the wrong way, then even if it's very unintentional, you're not helping. And that's just the way it is. Most of the time I do believe that most of the time when people victim blame, they're doing it to make themselves feel safer. But that's not what this is about. If you want to feel safer, about anything, you learn about it, you learn facts about it, and you apply, you use your intelligence and apply those facts to the way you live your life. You don't just say, so-and-so would never do that, or you were drunk and I don't get that drunk, or they slipped you something and I would never be that stupid, which is really what a lot of what is said to rape victims boils down to. Most people don't try to be that rude about it. Some do. So, yeah, a lot of what we say of being dismissive about victims is to make ourselves feel better. What that does to victims is, again, it says, I don't believe you, you're stupid. What happened to you wasn't that bad. Or, well, you made this happen. Well, okay, that's one that, especially I think with child victims, with very young victims, children's mind just works that way. Children can't wrap their mind around the fact that they have no control over something that happened to them. And it becomes a coping mechanism for all of us. That's basically what superstitions are all about. That's basically what a lot of silly things that humans do are based around trying to generate a sense of control over a situation we have no control over. Because if we have control over something, we can keep it from happening. Domestic violence victims are the classic example of this. That they make themselves, well, if I just do this and this and this and this and this and this and this, it won't happen. Rape victims kind of do this, often will do the same thing. They'll often, well, it was my fault. And that is a crippling belief for an adult to possess. It is my fault that somebody else did this to me. It's completely unhealthy. It's completely illogical. When you start to believe that you're responsible for somebody else's behavior, that sets you up on a very bad path in life. But it happens. So you never want to imply to a victim, I mean, their mind is going to go there anyway, most likely. You never want their mind to stay there. You want to do everything you can to get their mind away from there. There's nothing wrong with reflexively saying, if somebody tells you they were sexually assaulted, to say, I'm sorry, that wasn't your fault. In my circles, that is almost reflexive. That is almost like saying good afternoon to somebody. When you hear somebody say, or like somebody sneezes, you say bless you. It's almost like that among kind of the really heavy-duty advocates who deal with hearing survivor disclosures all the time. Because everybody needs to hear it, and it's much better for somebody to hear it too many times than not enough. So let's just just kind of recap. If somebody tells you they were sexually assaulted, I'm sorry. What can I do to help you? It wasn't your fault. That's not that hard. It's much easier than going in there like Columbo, like going in there like a detective. And well, who did this to you? Well, really? Well, what were you doing then? Why? I thought you were there. That's actually just something I'll elaborate on a little bit. If somebody does disclose a sexual assault and their story sounds horrible, like they are not able to give a detailed account, or they're really fuzzy, or they might have, if you do what I just recommended you not do and start asking for details, or if they volunteer them, and the details are weird or contradictory or whatever, that doesn't mean they're lying. It doesn't mean they made it up. It doesn't mean anything. They've actually done research about how the brain processes traumas like that. And I'm trying to think of a good way to put this, but those memories, there's too much emotion around the memories when they are that fresh. The best police detectives, the best training now is not to question a rape victim until about 2 days have passed after the crime. If a rape victim comes in shortly after the crime, take a very preliminary report, and if you can do a sexual assault nurse examiner exam, it's called a SANE exam or a rape kit. Well, the rape kit is part of that. If you can do that, do that. Take a very, very preliminary report about, who, what, when, where. And that's it. They've actually decided that they need to let these victims go home after all of that. And coming in just to a police station, that's not something most of us do for fun. people who've just been raped don't do it for fun either. They're not having a good day. Going to a police station isn't going to make it better. To have an exam where you're taking off your clothing and being touched is not a lot of fun. And if you've just been raped, it's really not making it any better. But the police, that's all bad enough. And the exams do need, if they're to get viable evidence, they want them to happen as soon as humanly possible after the crime, especially before the victim is showered or anything like that. So, but the police have learned you're not going to get anything useful by interrogating a victim after all of that. Let them go home, let them get a little bit of rest, let them recharge their batteries a little bit. And they've actually studied it, and that they don't get good disclosures, they don't get good interviews immediately after the rape has happened. And so they ended up dismissing a lot of cases that were actually viable and were actually capable of bringing the case forward, but they hadn't because they were interrogating the victims too soon. That's not the way it works for all crimes. That is the way it works for rape, and that is now considered the absolute best practice. It's not often done. But it's not the job of anyone except the police officer to do any interrogation at all. I'm going to hammer that home because it's a very natural thing for people to do. It's a very natural thing to, well, who did it? Does it mean and you could entirely be thinking, well, who did it because I want to know, or who did it because I want to make sure I'm safe. But that is not the time. That, when you've got somebody who's come up to you and has said all that, that's not the time to do it. Another thing is, it's incredibly unlikely that you're going to encounter somebody, moments after, in a parking garage, or so you're going to encounter a stranger who's been raped in some desolate place. Most likely it's going to be somebody is going to come to you quite a while after the fact, and they're going to come to you because you're a friend, not because you're there and nobody else is. So the other thing that is really important is if you can't talk about it, because it's too triggery for you, or you're just for whatever reason, if you know that you can't talk about it in a non-judgmental way, you know that you just can't talk about it at all, you know that you're listening to this lecture right now and you're like, oh my God, I can never do it. It's okay to tell somebody that. And you want to be polite about it. You want to say, I am so sorry this happened to you. I believe you. It wasn't your fault. But this is really triggery for me, and I just can't deal with it. I just can't handle any more of this. Let's see if we can find somebody else you can talk to. That might not be a perfect answer, but it's a better one than saying you can help somebody when you can't. So, just to kind of elaborate on this a little bit, I was in a very bad car accident a year ago. Actually, I think it was a year ago today. And it made me really think about trauma and traumatic memories and how we handle all of this. I have talked to police before about my own sexual abuse, all with the intent of hoping they could do something about my abuser. And So I know how police handle that sort of thing. And I've been a pretty law-abiding citizen otherwise for the rest of my life. But when you get in a car accident, I had to give a, well, the police had to come over and do I mean, it was bad. My car got totaled. I had to give a statement to the police. Then I had to give a statement to the insurance company. I had to really, at one point I even realized that the statement I gave to the insurance company an hour or two after the accident made no sense. When I saw the car the next day and saw where the way it was damaged, I'm like, this is not what I said. I had to actually think about it and close my eyes and go back to that place in my mind. And then I remembered what exactly had happened and why my recollection, why what I said to the insurance agents wasn't exactly accurate. But you know what? They still paid the claim. Nobody at any point accused me of lying. Nobody called me back and like, really? Let's go over this again. This is inconsistent. None of that. Because we know the car accidents are bad. Because we know you don't have to be a really horrible person to get into one. With rape, it's very different. We don't think that good people can rape or that good people are going to get raped. So we make up these great little stories about, that make us feel better, but if we believe them, it makes victims feel a lot worse. The only way we're ever going to change this, the only way we're ever going to become a society where we don't blame victims and where we can really move forward with putting blame, putting consequences on people who do this, is by getting rid of each and every one of those little myths that make us feel comfortable and believing victims. So, I mean, really, that's the impact of not believing a victim. It means a lot to that victim, and it has ripples throughout the rest of society. Just another thing, like, even in conversation, even like at work, if there's a high-profile rape case or high-profile child sexual abuse case, and you hear people are talking about it, and people are weighing in with, oh, well, they never got convicted, they never got, this never happened, that, I don't believe them. Every time you say that, you are, if there's a survivor in that room, you injured them a little bit. You didn't necessarily ruin their life. They're not necessarily gonna hate you, but you did something, you caused them a little bit of pain and a little bit of harm. And that's not cool. You held somebody's recovery back a little bit. And that's not cool. The statistics tell us it's a good idea to believe victims. We should do that. We believe people for the most part when they tell us they're victims of any other kind of violence or misfortune. We need to start extending that courtesy to sexual assault victims. So remember, somebody tells you they were raped, somebody tells you they were sexually victimized as a child. I'm sorry. I believe you. Is there anything I can do to help you? Those are incredibly, incredibly important things to remember. Just, little things can change the world. So, okay, thanks a lot, folks.